Hi gang, Titus, the hero of the Space Marine video game series, has finally found his way into the ongoing saga of Warhammer 40k in the 500 Worlds campaign. So let's look into the lore of the campaign and find out what the newly invested captain of 2nd Company did next. Hey, we've got new t-shirts in the merch store. Click the link in the description to find out more. So, the next big narrative expansion for the Warhammer 40k setting is 500 Worlds, subtitled Titus and chronicling the exploits of your favourite grumpy video game Space Marine as he joins him with the reconquest of Ultramar, starting with the world of Nova Magnor and his first encounter with a particularly insane Necron Overlord. The supplement is 4 books big, a boarding action supplement, a regular supplement for the Vespertor front, a detachment booklet, and a background book that tells the story of Titus's involvement, covering the recent activities of our captain since the events of Space Marine 2 and Secret Level, his deployment to the world of Nova Magnor on the Vespertor front, and also a broad overview of how the wider Ultramar campaign is going. So, in the interests of setting the scene a bit, let's start there. As always, the Imperium is under threat. Defeat follows defeat, and the light of hope is dimming, and in command of all this, attempting to hold it together, is Roboute Guilliman. There are many things that he remembers from his time during the Great Crusade, ideals that he thinks the Imperium should return to, but it's clear that that is a nigh impossible task. Some of those ideals are obviously way too much for the Imperium to deal with, and he's become adept at choosing his battles. He concentrates on only a few. Obviously, the big one of those is still the Indomitus Crusade, to restore order to the galaxy and shore up the defences of the Imperium, but the other one's more personal, the reformation of his homeworlds of Ultramar. The rest of the Imperium might be sliding into decay, resistant to the ideals of the ancient Great Crusade, but Ultramar is strong and stable, and he will not see its ancient worlds subjected to the same stagnation as the rest of the Imperium. So, in the wake of the Plague Wars, the entire military of the current Ultramar has been mobilised. Every asset is activated in order to maybe keep the flame alive. And not just in the 9 systems still ruled by the Ultramarines chapter, but the whole of what used to comprise the 500 Worlds, a somewhat euphemistic name for the domains of Ultramar back in the days of the Great Crusade. Ultramar back then was a jewel in the new Imperium, later reduced to only a few systems with the reforms of the Second Founding. I have a video on how that all worked here, and by the 41st millennium, many worlds across the Eastern Fringe had been freed of the influence of Ultramar and subjected to the regular horror of the 40k galaxy. And it was those ancient domains that would be brought back. The whole operation is a colossal plan that was only really able to be conceived by a Primarch, and even he knows it's a gamble. He can't leave the Indomitus Crusade. He's planned as much of it as he can, but ultimately the endeavour to restore Ultramar to its previous size and shield it from the decline of the Imperium is up to his sons, the Ultramarines and their allies. This isn't necessarily just a mission of conquest either. Many of the worlds on schedule to be reabsorbed are already Imperial, but convincing them to renew their ancient oaths to Ultramar, if they even remember that they had them, is more akin to convincing them that Guilliman isn't trying to supplant the Emperor. In other places, the political job's easier, since the worlds have been abandoned or captured by Xenos, but the material and logistic cost of reconquest is very high. Forces available for that reconquest are large, but not infinite. The Ultramarines are expected to operate across all the Imperium, not just in Ultramar. Since the Great Rift, there's been a massive requirement for the Ultramarines to deploy elsewhere, for example in Zone Bastior against Hive Fleet Leviathan, or on Vigilus across the Nakban Gauntlet. But the Ultramarines aren't the only forces active in Ultramar. They're assisted by large numbers of Defence Auxilia regiments and the colossal Ultramar Defence Fleet, as well as 9 other shield chapters of Space Marines with strong ties to the region charged with its defence. And the original Reconquest Order had come with the reinstallation of the role of Tetrarch. The 4 Tetras of Greater Ultramar were each commanded by one captain from either the Ultramarines or from their allies who was in charge of that area's expansion. For a while now, other conflicts had taken precedence. The first captain, Agamemnon, himself a tetrarch, had been fighting in Warzone Bastion in the Segmentum Pacificus, as had the newly made captain of Second Company, Demetrian Titus. Both were long overdue a return to their homeworlds, and with their Primarch's new orders, both set off into the void to honour their other role. The 4 different fronts of Ultramar all had different requirements, with different enemies to contend with. Captain Agamemnon deployed directly into his own domains as Tetrarch of Connor, the northern front of the expansion. The area he's been charged with reconquering has a mix of Imperial and heretic-held systems, including a large Orc pirate kingdom. He's devised an extremely complex strategy, second only to those planned by Guilliman himself, channeling all strategic information through his own field command. Agamemnon has assigned himself to the war on Dorvinus against the forces of the Wordbearers, and the wider conflict in the area is assisted by the Sons of Aura Shield chapter and by Ferrin Arius, captain of 6th Company, who commands forces on Siccar Magna. The southern Andamong front is under the control of Captain Porton of the Genesis chapter, and it's the smallest potential conquest area, but its warp routes are very fickle and complicated, and this has led to the growth of numerous pirate havens and minor alien empires. Portan has commanded a slow but meticulous advance, making sure that each conquest is fortified with defense auxilia to suppress dissent, whether the rulers want them there or not. The largest threats in this area are holdout forces from the Death Guard, retreating after the Plague Wars, and of course fleets of Orc pirates. The Protoss front to the west is under the command of Captain Balthus of the Doom Eagles and has now become known as the Haunted Front due to the supernatural threats and catastrophes that have been going on in the area. The campaign here is mostly led by the Doom Eagles chapter, and human auxiliary elements have struggled to match the chapter's speed of conquest. The Doom Eagles are expanding as quickly as they can and recruiting as much as they can to keep up the pace. And finally, the Eastern Vespator front is commanded by Decimus Felix of the Ultramarines. This is the most diffuse and rambling front, and many of the systems marked for inclusion contain large industrial bases that are vital to the future operation of wider Ultramar. The issues here are twofold. First, Felix has had to deal with the machinations of rulers unhappy with becoming part of Ultramar again, isolated for so many years on the fringes of the galaxy. On Ikaron, the Reborn chapter had to deal with truculent imperial governors who have been opportunistically stealing resources from the Crusade. And then second, the location of the front to the far east attracts exotic and ancient Xenos threats. Splinter Tyranid fleets still plague the Outer Dark, and the Ultramarines have had to deploy against Necron forces appearing through various hypertransit gateways, and it's here that the Second Company and Captain Titus have deployed. Demetrian Titus has had an eventful few years. After the campaign on Residius, which saw him cross the Rubicon Primaris and be reinstated Lieutenant of Second Company, and after a mission to Ja'uk to destroy a nest of demon worshippers, Titus was ordered to muster his forces under the command of Chapter Master Calgar in the Bastion sector, fighting against Hive Fleet Leviathan. He fought on the world of Olandrian, defending the Martyr's Palace, and delivered the final blade stroke to saw the head from a Norn emissary known as the Ghoul of Rashlav to defend that agri-world. When the captain of Second Company, Captain Akaran, fell in the Pyamote system, attempting to end the domination of a gene-stealer cult on the world of Trig, Titus was the obvious choice for succession and was invested as captain of the Second Company, a position he had held before, but this position came with additional responsibilities. The Second Company captain traditionally holds the rank of Master of the Watch. To him now falls the responsibility of defending the borders of Ultramar, borders that are of course now planned for constant expansion. None are better equipped to withstand the burden of that duty. In fact, his tendency to lead from the front has now been tempered by his new command responsibilities. Under his rule are the Ultramarines of Second Company and their supporting armour and specialists, as well as a substantial strength of auxiliary regiments, and he now relies on a close-knit circle of advisors and confidants drawn from across those forces. Also under his command is a small but powerful fleet of warships from from the Ultramar defense fleet along with attendant craft from the Adeptus Mechanicus, including the Emperor-class battleship Magnificence Enthroned, commanded by one of his advisors, Commodore Gaius Silva. The force is led by Titus's own ship, the Righteous Fury, a unique strike cruiser with extensively modified launch bays and upgraded plasma drives. Captain Titus and his forces initially deployed to the extended flank of the Vespator front. The agri-world of Iderus in the Heliodras system had been assaulted by Tyranids from a splinter fleet of Leviathan. This was a newly won area for Ultramar, and as part of his duty of security, a major Tyranid incursion couldn't be ignored. And so, as the ground of the world was being torn apart by bioforms, Titus's fleet struck like a lightning bolt, conducting boarding actions through the fleshy corridors of bioships and deploying by drop assault to the surface for a 3-day purge. Meanwhile, with the Ultramarines deployed to the planet and eager to stop the source of this invasion, his advisors got to work trying to figure out the original origin point of the Splinter Fleet. But along the route, there turned out to be an anomaly. The planet of Nova Magnor was a relatively recent colony of the Empire, rich in raw materials, but had been totally ignored by the Hive Fleet, who sort of went around it. Captain Titus had spent a long time in the Death Watch, the Imperium's foremost anti-Xenos operation, and he'd seen similar things before, especially when a world had a strong, hidden Necron presence. With the purge of Iderus complete, the fleet made place for Nova Magnor. Nova Magnor was listed as a busy new planet with a mix of urban and industrial zones, but when the Second Company fleet arrived, the planet was very, very different. Vox ghosts full of distress calls, strange energy signatures, and rolling black storm clouds covered the planet. It was clear that the Tomb World had awoken to some degree, but all was not yet lost. Around the capital settlement of Firstbrand, centered on the Obstinus Bastion complex, the local planetary defense forces, under the command of Governor Gallo, were still resisting the waking Necrons. Titus took a council with his advisors to figure out the plan, but before a decision was reached, fresh alarms tolled through the ship, and a massive Necron vessel, one that dwarfed much of his fleet, rose from the surface of the planet. Strangely, it didn't launch into any sort of assault. Instead, it was only firing its weapons to clear airspace above it, as it clearly attempted to escape orbit. However, this was a Xenos ship. The Imperium showed no such restraint. It was clear that the ship had already suffered heavy damage before its takeoff, and so Titus immediately redirected his assault towards it. The ship was assaulted by boarding torpedoes, and Titus led his command squad through its sparking, smoking corridors. But as the assault force made its way through ranks and ranks of Necron warriors, it became clear they were heading towards a central command post. And when they emerged into the command center and defeated the imperious Necron noble and his bodyguards that were waiting there, it seemed they had been defending something. Central to the chamber was a mysterious device, an intricate-looking Necron artifact surrounded by arcs of green energy. But while Titus initially planned to destroy the artifact, he was stopped by another advisor, Archmagos Oct, a specialist in xenotech who insisted that this was in fact a great Necron weapon that could be used against the rest of the Xenos on the planet. With permission from Titus, Oct sequestered the device and descended with a delegation of Mechanicus assets to Firstbrand's northern forge complex to study it, as Titus led a full combat drop into the city. The situation on the planet was dire. From the various wastelands had emerged giant black Necron tomb structures centered on a site named Umbra, supported by smaller emergent sites around the planet. But while the human population had come under attack all across the planet, it seemed that the attackers were extremely poorly organized. Random bands of Necron warriors would appear piecemeal, seemingly without any central command. Titus' initial theory was that the site was either very early in its reawakening process, or maybe the subject of competing Necron interests that might have led to a breakdown of control. After all, it was clear that that large ship that had taken off was fleeing something on the planet. Attempting to cut off the reawakening at its heart, Titus assembled a strike force and immediately departed for Site Umbra, accompanied by a delegation of tech priests transporting one of his strike cruiser's vortex missiles. His plan was to deliver the payload, get out, and then destroy the primary site remotely. But when their gunships landed at Umbra, They found a site of devastation. The floor of the tomb complex was carpeted with shining Necron bodies. Scorch marks were burned into the walls, and deactivated Necrons hung from their support cradles. Walking across this floor of metal bodies, the strike team made quick progress to the central chamber of the complex without opposition. It was only when they attempted to activate the bomb that retaliation appeared. Necron destroyers tore their way through shimmering portals, assaulting the Ultramarines from every side, and when the Ultramarines reconfigured themselves into a defensive pattern, a massive Necron lord emerged, and as he strode into reality, the fallen androids carpeting the floor slowly rose, their eyes lit by a strange sort of madness. The Destroyer Madness is one of many strains of insanity that have afflicted the Necrons during their long sleep, their engrams corrupting in strange and dangerous ways. To those afflicted by it, all life is repugnant, and they eventually become agents of annihilation who wish only to scour worlds of any life. Necrosaur Amantar is said to be the first to succumb to the madness of this virus. Amantar is ancient, so ancient that no records exist within the Necron Empire of his original provenance, or indeed what his title, Necrosaur, actually means anymore. But he's known throughout the various Necron dynasties and hated for his unique beliefs. Amantar's millennia of madness eventually led him to adopt the ancient Catan, Asgorod the Nightbringer, the symbol of mortal death, as a sort of patron of his quest, venerating its ancient shards in a quasi-religious way. The Necrosaur is devoted to recovering all the extant shards of the Nightbringer and recombining them to resurrect his god, something that is considered dangerous, horrific madness to the vast majority of the Necron nobility. In recent years, his cursed legion had spread across the galactic southeast. Tomb worlds encountered, often forcibly woken, its dynasties co-opted or conquered, and the Necrons inside infected with the Destroyer Madness. And it was this that had led them to Nova Magnor, which they called Ushemek. After destroying the Sarakan dynasty world of Maznok and converting the Sarakan forces to his cause, he led his legion through ancient portals to the world. Ushemek's overlord, Haskatef, had been entrusted by his Sautek dynasty with a particularly potent shard of the Nightbringer housed in a Tesseract vault, one that they had of course attempted to escape with, but was now in the possession of Archmagos Oct in the Forge complex at First Brand. Necrosaur Amantar's emergence into the chamber and the raising of the dead Necrons forced the Imperials to fall back, with the tech priests who were attempting to set up the bomb slain. Titus and his command squad escaped the tomb complex and were recovered by their orbiting gunships. When they returned to First Brand, they found the defenders under renewed assault by now coordinated Necron forces, often led by strange floating figures bearing giant scythes. Standard Codex practice in this situation would have been to fall back from the planet and await reinforcements before opening a whole new front, but Titus was unwilling to leave the Nova Magnorians to their fate. As the new Master of the Watch, what message would that send? Instead, his forces deployed through the city, Ultramar militia bolstering the PDF as members of his Wardens of Ultramar, led by Legatus Minervus and supported by Silver's fleet, took command of the defense. And through the fighting, he began to notice discrepancies in the various Necron forces. While many of the Necrons, including the ones raised from the floor of the tomb complex, bore the Sautekan symbols, also borne by the Lord who'd attempted to escape, they were different from either the strange symbols on the bodies of the destroyers or those of many of the current attackers. In fact, attackers bearing the glyph of Sarek were growing in number, as if the Necrons who inhabited the tombs were being reinforced from some other world. It seemed, unfortunately, that the best plan was to attempt the same thing again. Second Company would try and journey back to the main tomb complex, this time attempting to access it covertly via one of the subsidiary complexes, with the intent of detonating the missile and hopefully closing down the Necron portals that led to the world. Meanwhile, the Shard of Asgorod, now returned to the Forge complex, called out to the Necrosaur, and the tomb complex emptied as the entire might of Amantar's Oblivion Oblivion Court led their armies towards the city. Approaching from a sheltered valley, the main assault came without warning. A tide of living metal descended on the city. Artillery and infantry battalions ripped apart by insane metal robots, all led by the Necrosaur and his commanders. Even the governor's private troops were deployed, attempting to lead a last stand, but were cut apart by Gauss flayers. But as Necron forces overran the city and converged on the central bastion, ready to remove the most formidable symbol of Imperial resistance, the tide of metal wheeled around. Their destination was not the bastion, but the Forge of the Divine Cog, the current resting place of the Tesseract Vault. And it was here that the Necrosaur would find Archmagos Oct, who was, in some ways, expecting him to turn up. Oct, it turned out, knew exactly what was in the device and didn't consider it a weapon after all. Oct was a member of the Martian cult of the Dragon, a heretical sect on Mars who worshipped the ancient Catan as angels of the Omnissiah. Archmagos Oct believed that the Shard of Asgarod was in fact a divine angel of the machine god, and he'd been attempting to free it, but with little success so far. When the Destroyer Lord broke down the doors to the Forge complex and slithered its way inside, it found Oct kneeling in supplication, willing to do anything to free what he called the Angel. He was, of course, slaughtered by the Necrosaur, who claimed another shard of the Nightbringer for his collection. Meanwhile, while this was happening, Titus had been leading his second strike back into the tombs. He believed himself responsible for releasing these Necrons in his initial attack, unaware it was just an ambush and bad timing, and so he was intent on destroying the tomb complex with a vortex bomb to make amends. His forces had inserted themselves at a nearby site, a secondary tomb complex designated Site Obscurum, which had been shown to have connecting tunnels that led through to the main complex at Site Umbra, and after a close-fought battle in the depths of the planet, they found their way back to the chamber containing the bomb. There, he fought the Necron rearguard, led by a Nemesaur of Amantar's Oblivion Court, smashing aside her energy-wreathed war scythe and eventually driving his chainsword through her torso as his tech marines sought to finally release the bindings on the vortex bomb. With the limited defenders slaughtered and the Nemesaur dead, the Ultramarine strike force exited the tomb complexes just as the vortex bomb detonated behind them, destroying the Necron command centers and the main site of entry. Nothing remained of the tomb complex outside a circular crater 5 miles in diameter, but it was only when he emerged and reviewed the local strategic developments that he realized the main battle had been happening outside. By the time the Ultramarines escaped the tomb complex, satisfied that they'd stymied any Necron reinforcement, First Brand was all but destroyed. While its commanders had successfully evacuated whatever forces they could, the city and the governor were both lost, as was the Forge complex and the mysterious artifact that Archmagos Oct had been studying. And that led to a strange idea of victory. Though it was at great cost, for Titus, the plan had succeeded and Nova Magnor was saved from Necron assault. The flow of Necron reinforcements choked and the giant Necron Lord he had fought in the tomb seemed to have disappeared. But Amantar had in fact got his objective. Another shard of the Catan, another step closer to reviving his god of death. And though he left some of his forces on the surface to try and continue the extermination, the Necrosaur led his Oblivion Court through a lesser-known transspatial nexus in one of the smaller complexes and onwards to another world. The Vespertor front would likely see Necrosaur Amantar again. And then finally, far across Ultramar, on the opposite Protoss front, a fleet of dark ships hove into view, led by a colossal star fortress, recognized immediately by the defense fleet as the Rock, Fortress Monastery of the Dark Angels chapter, bearing incoming communiques from their Primarch, communiques that said one thing: brother, we need to talk. So we can assume that's where the 500 Worlds campaign will be going next, right? This is an interesting set of books. It's an attempt to fold a few things together. We have a very narrative-focused supplement, the sort of supplement that would have been called a Crusade supplement a year ago, and that's sold alongside an actual bit of lore development for a video game character, and also wrapped in a great big new Battlefront for 40k. And of course, the issue with those grand Battlefronts is always that the campaign books can only tell a small fraction of the story. In reality, Obviously, the war on Nova Magnor didn't really change much or tell us much about the wider Ultramar campaign, but it does show us the sort of conflicts happening across the sector and the sort of conflicts that are now Titus's responsibility to solve. I assume from the title that this will be followed by another 500 Worlds installment, one that isn't focused on Titus at some point, but let's see. For now, I actually think the most interesting lore development here is the introduction of Necrosaur Amintar. I know it's basically an excuse to release new destroyer models, but the introduction of a new, non-dynastic and also crazily religious Necron faction is quite a nice idea. A Necron faction that are almost attempting to bring back the old 3rd edition Necron, where the Catan really were these giant star gods leading them. So it'll be interesting to see where the narrative goes with that. Anyway, I guess we'll see what happens when the next installment comes out. Until then, thanks for watching. And if you'd like to hear more about the campaigns of the Warhammer 40k world, then there should be a little video popping up to the right there. And of course, if you'd like to support the channel, there's a load of ways you can do it. Obviously, like and subscribe. It's a new year, you should do that. Like and subscribe me. Also, there's a Patreon and there's a YouTube membership scheme with various perks. And of course, there's merch in the store. Links for all those things are in the thing below. See ya.